February 1959. Somewhere in the northern Urals, where temperatures plunge to 40 degrees below zero, and wind can strip the skin from your face in a matter of minutes, 9 people were walking toward their fate. They were no strangers to the mountains. They were young, educated, experienced. They had grown up under Soviet skies, forged in the discipline of sport and the camaraderie of hiking. They knew the dangers of the Siberian winter. They had faced them before and returned. This time they would not return. What happened to them on the slopes of the mountain known as Kholat Shakhl, which in the language of the Mansi people means mountain of the dead, remains, more than 6 decades later, one of the most disturbing enigmas of modern history. It was not a simple mountaineering accident. The circumstances defy all conventional explanation. The bodies were found scattered over a radius of more than a kilometer, some half-naked in lethal temperatures, others with devastating internal injuries, but no visible external wounds. The tent had been slashed from the inside, as if something or someone had forced its occupants to flee into the frozen night, without even time to put on their shoes. What can force 9 experienced people to abandon their only shelter against death from hypothermia? What force can cause skull fractures and broken ribs without leaving marks on the skin? Why did some of the clothing show traces of radiation? And why did the Soviet government close the investigation just weeks later, sealing the files for decades and prohibiting access to the area? This account does not intend to offer definitive answers. No serious investigator can do so. What we will do is reconstruct, step by step, what we know for certain. Who these people were, what led them to that mountain, what the rescue teams found, and what the available evidence tells us. We will examine the theories that have emerged over the years, from the most mundane to the most extraordinary, evaluating each against the documented facts, and in the end we will be left where we started, facing a mystery that resists explanation, facing 9 truncated lives whose final hours remain shrouded in shadow. This is the story of the Dyatlov Pass incident. To understand what happened in the Urals in February 1959, we must first understand the world in which these young people lived. The Soviet Union of the late 1950s was a nation of profound contradictions, an empire that looked toward the stars while keeping its citizens under constant surveillance. Barely 3 years had passed since the 20th Congress of the Communist Party, where Nikita Khrushchev had delivered his famous secret speech denouncing the crimes of Stalin. The Gulag still existed, but its gates were beginning to open. Millions of political prisoners were being rehabilitated, though the collective trauma of the purges remained etched in the memory of an entire generation. It was the era of the thaw, a period of relative cultural and political openness that, however, never became true freedom. The state continued to control every aspect of public life. Censorship continued to operate, and Cold War paranoia permeated all institutions. In October 1957, barely 15 months before the Dyatlov Pass tragedy, the Soviet Union had launched Sputnik, the first artificial satellite in history. The entire world had heard its characteristic beeping transmitted from space, and the West had panicked. The space race was in full swing, and the Soviets were in the lead. This technological triumph had a dark side. The same technology that put satellites into orbit served to develop intercontinental ballistic missiles. The Urals, that mountain range separating Europe from Asia and stretching from the Arctic to the steppes of Kazakhstan, housed some of the country's most secret military installations. The closed city of Chelyabinsk 40, later known as Ozyorsk, was located several hundred kilometers south of Dyatlov Pass. There operated the Mayak nuclear complex, where just 2 years earlier, in 1957, one of the worst nuclear accidents in history had occurred. The explosion of a radioactive waste tank that contaminated thousands of square kilometers and was kept secret for decades. The Urals were, in many ways, the industrial and military backyard of the Soviet state, a region of incalculable natural resources, but also of well-guarded secrets. In this context, sport tourism, known in Russian as tourism, occupied a special place in Soviet life. It was not simply a pastime, it was an activity actively promoted by the state as a way to forge character, develop physical endurance, and foster love for the vast geography of the motherland. Universities and technical institutes had their own hiking clubs, where students could obtain certifications according to their level of experience and the difficulty of the routes they completed. Expeditions were classified into categories, from the first to the third, the latter being the most demanding and dangerous. The Ural Polytechnic Institute, located in the city of Sverdlovsk, today Yekaterinburg, had one of the most active hiking clubs in the country. Its members had explored the surrounding mountains for years, accumulating experience in conditions that would have proved fatal for less prepared hikers. It was a world of camaraderie, idealism, and adventure. Young Soviets of that era grew up singing songs around campfires, sharing tents on frozen nights, forging friendships that would last a lifetime. The region where the tragedy occurred was not uninhabited. For centuries, the Mansi people had lived in these inhospitable lands, hunting, fishing, and herding reindeer. They were one of many indigenous peoples of Siberia, with their own language, their own traditions, and their own cosmology. The Mansi knew these mountains like no one else. They knew which places to avoid, what signs to watch for in the sky and in the snow. And they had their own names for every peak and every valley. Kholat Shakhl, the Mountain of the Dead. The name was not coincidental. According to some versions, it referred to an ancient incident in which 9 Mansi hunters had perished on its slopes. According to others, it simply indicated that it was a place where nothing grew, where no animal sought shelter, where life itself seemed absent. The Soviets, with their militant rationalism and contempt for the superstitions of native peoples, renamed many geographical features in the region. The mountain pass, where the Dyatlov group camped, had no official name on the maps of 1959. After the tragedy, they would call it Dyatlov Pass. There were 9 of them, 7 men and 2 women, aged between 21 and 37. Most were students or recent graduates of the Ural Polytechnic Institute. They knew each other from the hiking club, where they had shared countless previous expeditions. They were friends, companions, in some cases something more. To know them is the first step toward understanding the tragedy. They were not names in a police report or statistics in a file. They were people with dreams, with fears, with their own stories that deserve to be told. Igor Alexeyevich Dyatlov was the leader of the group. At 23 years old, he was already a respected figure in Sverdlovsk's hiking circles. A student at the Faculty of Radio Engineering, he was known for his meticulousness, his leadership ability, and his passion for engineering. Dyatlov was not just a hiker, he was an inventor. He had designed and built a small portable wood-burning stove specifically for the extreme conditions of the Urals, a device that the group would carry with them on their final expedition. He had also built radio equipment for communication in remote areas. Those who knew him described him as a quiet but determined young man, capable of making difficult decisions under pressure. He was not prone to recklessness. His companions trusted him with their lives. The January 1959 expedition would be the culmination of his career as an amateur hiker. If he completed it successfully, he would obtain the Category 3 certification, the highest available. It was his last great adventure before graduating and beginning his professional life. Zinaida Alexeyevna Kolmogorova, Zina, as her friends called her, was 22 years old and a student at the Faculty of Radio Engineering, just like Dyatlov. She was known for her inexhaustible energy, her sense of humor, and her melodious voice. She was the one who usually led the singing around the nighttime campfires. But Zina was more than the group's entertainer. She was an experienced hiker in her own right, with multiple expeditions to her credit. The diaries recovered after the tragedy reveal a reflective, sensitive young woman who observed the world with a poet's eyes. They also reveal something more. Zina had been in a romantic relationship with Igor Dyatlov that had ended shortly before the expedition. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, she had decided to participate. The unresolved feelings between them added a layer of emotional tension to an already demanding journey. Lyudmila Alexandrovna Dubinina, Lyuda, was 21 years old and an economics student. She was known for her strong character and her refusal to be intimidated by anyone or anything. Dubinina had a reputation for being difficult. She did not accept condescension, did not tolerate being treated differently for being a woman, and had no qualms about expressing her opinions, even if they were unpopular. She was, in many ways, a woman ahead of her time. Her personal diary, which she carried with her during the expedition, would become one of the most valuable documents recovered by investigators. Her notes reveal a sharp and observant mind, though also a certain tendency toward melancholy. Lyuda Dubinina would be one of the last to be found, and her injuries would be among the most inexplicable of the entire group. Alexander Sergeyevich Kolevatov, Sasha, was 24 years old and a physics student. He had previously worked at a radioactive materials processing plant, a detail that some later investigators would find significant. Kolevatov was the scientist of the group. Methodical, analytical, always interested in understanding the why of things. His companions joked that he could spend hours discussing the thermodynamic properties of snow, if given the chance. He was also reserved. Unlike other members of the group, Kolevatov rarely spoke about his personal life or his past. Some of his companions knew he had had problems with the authorities at some point, though the details were never clear. Rustem Vladimirovich Slobodin was by far the most athletic member of the group. At 23 years old, he was a recently graduated engineer and an accomplished sportsman, skier, swimmer, elite hiker. His physical endurance was legendary among his companions. But Slobodin was more than muscle. He was also a cultured man, a lover of poetry and classical music. His friends remembered long nighttime conversations in which he could move from discussing survival techniques to reciting verses by Pushkin without missing a beat. Slobodin had a girlfriend in Sverdlovsk whom he planned to marry after the expedition. He never did. Yuri Alexeyevich Krivonishenko, Yuri K., was 24 years old and an engineer. He worked at the secret nuclear plant of Chelyabinsk 40, the same complex where the Kishtim disaster had occurred 2 years earlier. Krivonishenko was the clown of the group, always ready to make his companions laugh with jokes, humorous songs, and improvised performances. His mandolin was inseparable from him on expeditions, and nights around the campfire were not complete without his repertoire of folk songs and his own compositions. But behind the jovial facade was a more complex person. Krivonishenko had been a direct witness to the consequences of the 1957 nuclear accident. He had participated in cleanup work, exposing himself to radiation levels that today we would consider unacceptable. Some investigators would later wonder whether the radiation found on his clothing came from that earlier experience. Yuri Nikolaevich Doroshenko was the youngest of the men in the group, having just turned 21. Tall, sturdy, almost imposing in appearance, Doroshenko was nevertheless known for his gentle character and his willingness to help others. He had been Zina Kolmogorova's boyfriend before she began her relationship with Dyatlov. All three had decided to participate together in the expedition, despite this shared history, a demonstration of the emotional maturity that characterized the group, or perhaps of the Soviet capacity to subordinate personal feelings to the collective good. Doroshenko was studying at the Faculty of Radio Engineering and was considered one of the most promising hikers of his generation. Nikolai Vladimirovich Thibaut Brignol, whom everyone called simply Kolya, was 23 years old and a civil engineering student. His surname, clearly French, betrayed an unusual family origin for the Soviet Union of that era. Thibaut Brignol was the son of a French engineer who had emigrated to the USSR in the 1920s, attracted by the promise of building socialism. His father had been arrested during Stalin's purges and had died in a labor camp. Kolya had grown up with the stigma of being the son of an enemy of the people, though Stalin's death and the subsequent thaw had somewhat softened his situation. He was a serious, hard-working young man, determined to prove his worth despite the circumstances of his birth. The expedition to Otorten was an opportunity to prove himself. Finally, Semyon Alexeyevich Zolotaryov, whom they called Sasha or sometimes Alexander, was the oldest member of the group at 37, and in many ways the most enigmatic. Unlike the others, Zolotaryov was not a student at the Polytechnic Institute. He was a professional sports instructor who had joined the group shortly before the expedition, apparently to obtain his own Category 3 certification. Zolotaryov was a veteran of World War II, where he had fought as a combat engineer on the Eastern Front. He had tattoos on his body, something unusual for a respectable Soviet citizen of that era. He spoke little about his past, and some members of the group found him somewhat distant. What no one knew then, and what investigators would discover decades later, is that there were significant discrepancies in Zolotaryov's official biography. Some documents suggested connections to state security services. Others indicated that he had used different names at different times in his life. Who was Semyon Zolotaryov, really? What had led him to join a group of young students on a mountain expedition? Was he simply a hiking enthusiast? Or was there something more? These questions would remain unanswered. These were the 9. 9 people with lives, with stories, with futures they would never live to see. When they departed from Sverdlovsk on January 23, 1959, none of them could imagine that they were beginning a journey with no return. The plan was ambitious, but not reckless. The group intended to cover a route of approximately 300 kilometers through the northern Urals, reaching the summits of Otorten and Oykachachur before returning. The expedition would last approximately 16 days, enough time to cover the distance at a reasonable pace even in Arctic winter conditions. The preparation had been meticulous. Dyatlov, as leader, had personally supervised every detail. The equipment included skis, tents, sleeping bags, warm clothing, food for several weeks, a portable stove designed by Dyatlov himself, cameras, diaries, and a small medical kit. They also carried an axe, several knives, and a small amount of alcohol, the latter officially intended for medical purposes, though everyone knew it would also serve to warm spirits on the coldest nights. On January 23, 1959, the group departed from Sverdlovsk by train for the city of Ivdel, a small administrative center in the north of the region. From there they would continue by truck to Vizhai, the last settlement before entering the taiga. The train journey was lively. The young people sang songs, played the mandolin, joked and laughed. Other passengers would later remember them as a cheerful, full-of-life group. One of them, a student traveling in the same car, would recall years later that Zolotaryov had seemed somewhat apart from the rest, observing more than participating. In Ivdel, the group spent the night at a local school that gave them space to sleep. The next morning, January 26th, they continued to Vizhai in the back of a cargo truck. The cold was intense, but the group's enthusiasm did not wane. Vizhai marked the limit of civilization. Beyond lay only taiga, mountains, and silence. There they said goodbye to the truck driver and began the march on foot, carrying their backpacks and dragging their skis over the snow. On January 27th, one member of the group had to abandon the expedition. Yuri Yudin, the 10th original member, had begun to suffer intense pain in his back and leg, probably due to a sciatica problem that had worsened with the cold and exertion. With great regret, Dyatlov decided that Yudin must return. Yudin said goodbye to his companions at the camp of an abandoned logger called Second Northern. He would be the last to see them alive. Decades later, Yudin would reflect on that moment. He would remember having embraced each of his friends, not knowing it was the last time. He would remember the frustration of having to abandon the expedition, now mixed with an irrational guilt for having survived. If not for his back, he would have died with them. The most capricious chance had saved him. Yuri Yudin would dedicate much of his later life to investigating what had happened to his friends. He died in 2013, at 75 years old, without having found satisfactory answers. The diaries recovered after the tragedy allow us to reconstruct the group's last days with some detail. The entries reveal an expedition that up to a point was proceeding as planned. On January 28th, the group continued their march north, venturing ever deeper into uninhabited territory. The terrain was difficult, a combination of dense forest and slopes covered with deep snow. They advanced on skis, taking turns breaking trail. On January 29th, they left the tree line behind and entered the alpine zone, where only lichens and dwarf shrubs grew. The landscape became more desolate, more exposed to the elements. The wind blew with increasing force. On January 30th, a snowstorm forced them to stop and set up a temporary camp. The bad weather persisted for hours, confining them to their tents. The diaries from that day reflect some frustration at the delay, but also moments of humor. Krivonishenko entertained the group with songs and jokes, and someone composed a satirical wall newspaper called The Evening Otorten. On January 31st, with the weather somewhat improved, the group resumed their march. They built a small supply cache, a labaz in hiking terminology, where they left part of the food and equipment they would not need for the final assault on the summit. This would allow them to travel lighter and retrieve the supplies on their return. February 1st, 1959. Dawned cold, but clear. The group began the ascent toward the pass that separated the mountains of Kholatsiakhl and Otorten. Their objective was to establish a camp on the slope and from there complete the ascent to Otorten the following day. The last known photographs of the group were taken that day. They show the hikers advancing over the snow with concentrated but not distressed expressions. One image shows the moment they began digging in the snow to set up the tent. Another, the last of all, is blurry and dark, apparently taken at night. This last photograph has been the subject of intense debate. Some investigators believe they can see strange shapes in it, inexplicable lights. Others maintain that it is simply a failed image, the result of a camera accidentally triggered in the darkness. What we know for certain is that the group established their final camp on the northwestern slope of Kholatsiakhl, at an altitude of approximately 1,100 meters. It was an exposed location, without the protection of the trees they had left behind 1.5 kilometers below. Why did they choose that place? Experienced hikers know that camping on exposed terrain, in the middle of the Arctic winter, is risky. The protection of the forest would have offered shelter from the wind and access to firewood for the stove. Some theories suggest that Dyatlov wanted to train the group in conditions of extreme exposure, as preparation for even more demanding future expeditions. Others propose that bad weather or fatigue prevented them from descending to the tree line before nightfall. Still others speculate that something forced them to stop earlier than planned. Whatever the reason, there they pitched their tent. It was approximately 5 p.m. on February 1st, 1959. What happened next remains shrouded in mystery. The Dyatlov group had agreed to send a telegram from the village of Vizhai as soon as they completed the expedition. The planned date for this contact was February 12th, with a margin of a few days for unforeseen circumstances. When February 12th passed without news, no one was immediately alarmed. Delays were common in mountain expeditions, especially in winter. They might have encountered bad weather, a blocked route, any number of minor setbacks. On February 15th, some family members began to worry. On the 16th, the first rumors that something had gone wrong reached the Polytechnic Institute. On February 20th, 8 days after the planned return date, the authorities finally organized the first search team. The delay would have consequences. By the time the rescuers reached the area, nearly 3 weeks of snow and wind had altered the scene. Why did they take so long to react? Official explanations mention logistical difficulties, lack of resources, the vastness of the territory to be covered. But some investigators have pointed out that the delays seem excessive, even considering these factors. Were there orders to wait? Did someone know something they did not share? The first search team was composed of volunteers from the hiking club of the Polytechnic Institute, colleagues and friends of the missing. Soon they were joined by soldiers, police, and eventually military helicopters. The search initially concentrated on the group's planned route. The teams first found the supply cache they had left along the way. It was intact, indicating that the group had never returned for it. On February 26th, a helicopter spotted the tent on the slope of Kholat. What the rescuers found would defy all rational explanation. The tent was partially collapsed, half buried in snow. At first glance, it appeared to be the result of a storm or an avalanche. But closer examination revealed something disturbing. The tent had been slashed from the inside, not from the outside, as would have occurred if an animal or an attacker had tried to enter. The cuts in the canvas were clearly the result of knives wielded from the interior, as if the occupants had tried to escape by any available means, too desperate or too pressed for time to use the normal entrance. Inside the tent, rescuers found the group's equipment almost intact. The sleeping bags were spread out, the clothing was carefully folded or hung. The shoes and boots were lined up by the entrance. Dyatlov's stove was disassembled, as if they had just finished using it or were about to light it. There was food, partially consumed. There were cameras. There were the diaries that would later provide the only window into the group's final days. But there were no bodies. And there was almost no warm clothing. 9 people had abandoned the tent in the middle of the night, in temperatures of 30 degrees below zero, barefoot or in only socks, wearing barely the underwear they slept in. They had left behind everything that could have kept them alive. What had driven them to flee in this way? Rescuers followed the tracks leading from the tent. The snow had partially preserved the footprints, enough to determine that all 9 had walked, not run, in the direction of the valley, toward the tree line that lay approximately 1.5 kilometers down the slope. The tracks indicated a group moving in an orderly manner, not in uncontrolled panic. Some walked side by side. No one had been left behind, but neither had they returned to retrieve their equipment. It was as if they had fled from something so terrifying that they preferred to face certain death from hypothermia rather than remain in the tent. But organized enough not to scatter in the darkness. What kind of threat provokes that type of response? The first bodies were found on February 27th, the day after the discovery of the tent. Yuri Krivonishenko and Yuri Doroshenko lay together beneath a large cedar tree, approximately 1.5 kilometers from the tent, right at the edge of the tree line. They were in their underwear, barefoot, and had clearly died of hypothermia. Beside them were the remains of a small fire, barely embers that could not have provided significant warmth. The lowest branches of the cedar had been torn off up to a height of 5 meters, as if someone had climbed seeking something, shelter, or perhaps a view of the tent in the distance. The hands of both young men showed burns and abrasions, consistent with the desperate attempt to keep the fire going and climb the tree with bare hands. Krivonishenko had a piece of flesh in his mouth, apparently bitten from his own hand in a final attempt to stay conscious. There were no signs of external violence. They had died of cold, alone in the darkness, minutes away from the supplies that could have saved them. Why did they not return to the tent? What prevented them from retracing their steps and retrieving the clothing, the boots, the sleeping bags that would have meant the difference between life and death? 300 meters from the cedar, uphill toward the tent, rescuers found the body of Igor Dyatlov. He lay on his back on the snow, with one arm raised as if trying to protect himself from something or reach for something that was no longer there. He was wearing somewhat more clothing than the two Yuris, but it was still tragically insufficient for the conditions. He had died of hypothermia like the others. His position suggested that he had tried to return to the tent, or perhaps that he had tried to go back to the cedar to help his companions. Whatever his intention, he had collapsed before reaching his goal. About 300 meters from Dyatlov, also on the slope between the cedar and the tent, the body of Zina Kolmogorova was found. Zina lay on her side in an almost fetal position, as if she had tried to conserve the little warmth she had left in her final moments. Her hands were bloodied, with broken nails, apparently from scratching the hardened snow in an attempt to keep moving. She was wearing more clothing than Dyatlov, including a hat and a jacket. But she was not wearing shoes. She had traveled hundreds of meters over snow and ice with unprotected feet before succumbing. The expression on her face, according to the rescuers who found her, was one of determination, even in death. She had fought to the end. The fifth body was found on March 5th, after the snow had begun to melt slightly. Rustem Slobodin lay between Dyatlov and Kolmogorova, also on the slope leading back to the tent. Slobodin presented a peculiarity that puzzled investigators. In addition to the obvious signs of death from hypothermia, the autopsy would later reveal a skull fracture 5 centimeters in length. However, there were no visible external wounds on his head, no blood, no bruises. How can a man suffer a skull fracture without external damage? The forensic doctors determined that the injury had not been sufficient to cause immediate death, but would have caused loss of consciousness. Slobodin had probably lost consciousness while trying to return to the tent, and had died of cold where he fell. But the question persisted. What had caused that fracture? 5 bodies had been found. 4 were missing. The search continued for weeks, but the deep snow and difficult terrain made the work almost impossible. Teams combed the area repeatedly, probing the snow with poles, looking for any sign. It was not until May 4th, more than 3 months after the tragedy, that the spring thaw finally revealed the fate of the 4 remaining hikers. They were found in a small ravine about 75 meters from the cedar, under 4 meters of snow. Apparently they had dug a kind of shelter, or had fallen into the ravine seeking protection from the wind. Their bodies were in a different state of preservation than the 5 found earlier, partly due to the time elapsed and partly due to conditions under the snow. Some showed signs of post-mortem animal activity, but the injuries revealed by the autopsies were of an entirely different order. Lyudmila Dubinina had multiple rib fractures, with bone fragments driven into her heart. The force necessary to cause these injuries was compared by the forensic doctor to that of a high-speed car accident. However, there were no corresponding external marks. No blow, no bruising, nothing to explain the internal damage. Additionally, Dubinina was missing her tongue. The oral cavity was empty, with no trace of the organ. She was also missing her lips, part of her eyes, and fragments of facial tissue. Semyon Zolotaryov presented similar injuries, broken ribs that had punctured internal organs, without visible external damage. He was also missing his eyes. Nikolai Thibault-Brignol had a massive skull fracture, much more severe than Slobodin's. The trauma was consistent with a blow of extraordinary force, but again, without corresponding external wounds. Only Alexander Kolevatov seemed to have died of hypothermia, without additional traumatic injuries, though his body showed signs of having been moved or manipulated post-mortem. Some of the clothing items from these 4 bodies, particularly those of Kolevatov and Dubinina, showed significant levels of radioactive contamination. Not in lethal amounts, but clearly above normal. Where did that radiation come from? And how had these people suffered such devastating internal injuries without external damage? The official investigation began almost immediately after the discovery of the tent. Prosecutor Lev Ivanov was assigned to the case and proceeded with autopsies, witness interrogations, and evidence collection. The autopsies were performed by Boris Vozrozhdeny, the regional forensic doctor. His reports, which partially survived the later destruction of many case documents, provide the most reliable data on the state of the bodies. For the first 5 bodies found, Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, Doroshenko, Krivonishenko, and Slobodin, the cause of death was determined to be hypothermia. Slobodin's skull fracture was considered a contributing factor, but not the direct cause. For the 4 bodies found in May, the conclusions were more complicated. Dubinina had died from internal hemorrhage caused by the rib fractures. Thibault-Brignol's had died from the cranial trauma. Zolotaryov had probably died from a combination of internal injuries and hypothermia. Only Kolevatov appeared to have succumbed solely to the cold. Vozrozhdeny stated that the injuries to Dubinina, Thibault-Brignol's, and Zolotaryov could not have been caused by another human being. The required force exceeded what any person could inflict with their hands or with common weapons. But if it was not a human, what was it? Prosecutor Ivanov methodically investigated all conventional possibilities. Had it been an animal attack? There were no claw or tooth marks on the bodies. Had it been an avalanche? The tent showed no signs of having been struck by a moving mass of snow, and the slope was not steep enough for a significant avalanche. Had it been a conflict among the group members? There were no weapons, no signs of struggle, and relations within the group appeared to have been cordial until the end. Ivanov also investigated the possibility of an attack by the Mansi people. Several members of the community were interrogated and even briefly detained, but there was no evidence connecting them to the tragedy, and the nature of the injuries was not consistent with a conventional human attack. The Mansi, for their part, avoided the area of Kolatsiakhl. They considered it a place of ill omen, a place where one should not camp. But their reasons had more to do with ancestral traditions than with knowledge of specific dangers. In May 1959, just weeks after the discovery of the last bodies, Prosecutor Ivanov abruptly closed the investigation. His official conclusion was extraordinarily vague. The hikers had died as a result of an overwhelming natural force that they could not overcome. What does that mean? What kind of overwhelming natural force causes internal fractures without external damage? What natural force tears the tongue from a woman without leaving marks on her face? The case documentation was classified as secret. Access to the area was prohibited for 3 years. The victims' families received instructions not to speak publicly about what had happened. In his memoirs, written decades later, Prosecutor Ivanov would hint that he had been pressured to close the case. He would mention having seen strange lights in the sky during the investigation, phenomena he could not explain. He would suggest that the truth was stranger than the official reports allowed to be revealed. But he was never explicit. He died in 1999, taking his secrets to the grave. The official investigation left behind more questions than answers, and the years that followed only added more layers of mystery. Several witnesses testified to having seen strange lights in the sky over the Urals during the night of February 1st to 2, 1959, approximately when the Dyatlov group would have met their fate. These lights were described in various ways: glowing spheres, elongated luminous objects, phenomena that did not resemble anything known. Some of these testimonies came from other groups of hikers who were in the region that night. Others came from local residents, including members of the Mansi people. The descriptions were inconsistent in details, but agreed on the fundamental point. Something unusual had illuminated the sky that night. Were they military rocket tests? The Urals were close to ballistic testing zones, and it was plausible that secret launches were conducted in the region. But official records, at least those that have been declassified, show no testing activity on that specific night. Were they natural atmospheric phenomena? The aurora borealis is occasionally visible at those latitudes, though February is not the most propitious month. Other phenomena, such as so-called sprites or ball lightning, are rare but not impossible. Or were they something more, something the Soviet authorities preferred to keep secret? Other testimonies were ignored or suppressed during the original investigation. Several residents of Ivdel testified to having seen a group of hikers that did not correspond to the Dyatlov group in the area during the days before the tragedy. Who were they? The records do not say. A helicopter pilot who participated in the search reported having seen strange marks in the snow near the tent, marks that did not correspond to human footprints or known animal activity. His report was apparently filed and forgotten. Years later, testimonies would emerge from people who claimed to have worked at secret military installations in the region. Some spoke of tests of new weapons, including devices that could cause internal damage without penetrating the skin. Others mentioned military exercises that would have coincided with the presence of the Dyatlov group in the area. None of these testimonies has been independently verified, but their existence suggests that there is more to this story than the official documents reveal. The Dyatlov case remained officially closed for decades, but it never ceased to generate speculation. As information began to leak, first as rumors and then as partially declassified documents, multiple theories emerged to explain the inexplicable. The first and most persistent is the avalanche theory. According to this hypothesis, a small avalanche or snowslide struck the tent during the night, causing the traumatic injuries and forcing the group to flee in panic. The pressure of the snow would have caused the internal fractures without leaving visible external marks. This theory has appeal for its simplicity. Avalanches are a known danger in the mountains, and compression injuries are consistent with being crushed by masses of snow. But it also has significant problems. The slope where the group camped was approximately 20 degrees, too gentle for a conventional avalanche. The tent, though damaged, did not show the typical signs of having been struck by a moving mass of snow. And the tracks leading from the tent indicated a group walking in an orderly fashion, not people fleeing in panic from an immediate natural disaster. Recent studies using advanced computer models have suggested that a specific type of avalanche called a slab avalanche could have occurred under very particular conditions. If the group had dug into the snow to level the ground for the tent, and if wind and temperature conditions had created a specific unstable snow layer. A small localized avalanche could have occurred hours after they set up camp. This hypothesis was promoted by a study published in 2021 that used simulations inspired by snow animation developed for the movie Frozen. The results suggested that conditions for such an avalanche were plausible, though not proven. However, even the authors of this study admitted that their model does not explain everything. It does not explain why the group did not return to retrieve their equipment once the immediate danger had passed. It does not explain the lights in the sky. It does not explain the radiation. It does not explain Dubinina's missing tongue. Another theory proposes that katabatic winds were responsible. Katabatic winds are currents of cold, dense air that descend mountain slopes, sometimes reaching hurricane speeds. These winds can generate infrasound, sound frequencies below the threshold of human hearing that, according to some studies, can cause sensations of panic, disorientation, and physical discomfort. According to this hypothesis, an extreme katabatic wind event struck the camp that night. The infrasound would have caused irrational panic in the group, leading them to flee from the tent. The extreme cold and wind would have made return impossible. This theory explains some aspects of the case: the apparently irrational panic, the flight toward the lower terrain, where the wind would be less intense, death from hypothermia. But it does not explain the traumatic injuries of the last 4 bodies, nor the radiation, nor many other details. A third category of theories involves secret military activity. The Urals, as we have mentioned, housed numerous military installations and testing zones. It was an era of intense activity in missile and nuclear weapons development. According to some versions of this theory, the Dyatlov group accidentally witnessed a secret military test, perhaps a rocket launch, perhaps the detonation of an experimental weapon. Authorities would have acted to silence them, either directly or through intimidation that led them to flee to their deaths. Other versions suggest that the group was collateral damage from a test that went wrong. A projectile or rocket fragments would have impacted near the camp, causing the injuries and forcing the evacuation. The presence of radiation on some clothing items is cited as evidence for this theory. Krivonishenko's previous work at Chelyabinsk 40 could explain part of the contamination, but some investigators argue that the detected levels were too high to be residual. Against this theory is the fact that no projectile fragments, explosive residues, or craters have been found in the area. And while Soviet secrecy was legendary, physically eliminating 9 citizens to conceal a military test would have been extreme even by the standards of the era. A fourth theory, more prosaic but equally disturbing, proposes human conflict within the group or with third parties. According to some versions, romantic tensions among group members recall the triangle between Dyatlov, Kolmogorova, and Doroshenko had escalated to violence. According to others, the group had encountered other people in the mountains, perhaps Gulag escapees, perhaps poachers, and the encounter had ended in tragedy. This theory has the virtue of not requiring inexplicable phenomena, but it has obvious problems. The injuries to Dubinina and Thibaut Brignol were specifically described as impossible to inflict by a human being. There were no weapons at the camp, and the idea that 9 close friends would kill each other without leaving any trace of conventional struggle seems implausible. There are also theories involving more exotic phenomena: encounters with extraterrestrial life, dimensional portals, unknown creatures in the mountains. These theories capture the popular imagination but lack any evidence to support them. We mention them here only because they form part of the folklore that has grown around the case, not because they deserve serious consideration as explanations. The truth is that no theory explains all the facts satisfactorily. Each hypothesis leaves loose ends, details that do not fit, questions without answers. And perhaps that is the most important lesson of the Dyatlov case. Sometimes reality is more complex and more opaque than our explanations can encompass. The Dyatlov case did not remain closed forever. As the Soviet Union disintegrated and secret archives began to open, new attempts emerged to investigate what really happened that February night in 1959. In 2019, 60 years after the tragedy, the Russian Prosecutor General's office announced an official reopening of the case. The prosecutor in charge, Andrei Kuryakov, declared that the objective was to apply modern forensic technology to the available evidence and reach a definitive conclusion. Expectations were high. Finally, many thought 21st century science could solve the mystery of the 20th century. The results published in 2020 were anticlimactic. Kuryakov concluded that an avalanche had been the cause of the tragedy. According to his report, a small avalanche had struck the tent, causing the traumatic injuries. The group had fled in zero visibility conditions and had been unable to return. The conclusion was met with skepticism by many independent investigators. They pointed out that the new investigation had not contributed significant new evidence, that many of the problems with the avalanche theory had not been resolved, and that the report seemed more interested in closing the case than in arriving at the truth. In parallel, independent investigators and amateurs have continued studying the case using diverse methods. Some have conducted expeditions to the area, recreating the conditions of the Dyatlov group to better understand what they faced. Others have analyzed the recovered photographs with digital enhancement techniques, looking for clues that might have been overlooked. A particularly intriguing finding came from the analysis of the group's last photographs. By increasing the brightness and contrast of some apparently failed images, some investigators believed they detected luminous forms that did not correspond to any known light sources. Others dismissed these forms as artifacts of the development process or damage to the film. New analyses of the original autopsy reports have also been conducted. Some modern forensic doctors have questioned some of Boris Vozrozhdeni's conclusions, suggesting that the injuries might have alternative explanations. Others have confirmed that internal fractures without external damage remain difficult to explain through conventional mechanisms. Computer modeling technology has allowed detailed reconstructions of the terrain and weather conditions of that night. These models have refined our understanding of what was physically possible, avalanches included, but have not provided a definitive answer. Ultimately, the fundamental problem remains. Too many of the original documents were destroyed or remain classified. Too many potential witnesses have died. The passage of time has eroded physical evidence and human memories. The complete truth, if there is a single truth, may be lost forever. What makes the Dyatlov case continue to resonate in our collective imagination so many decades after that fatal night in the Urals? It is in part the nature of the victims. They were young, educated, full of life and plans for the future. They were people with whom we can identify, not very different from us or our children or our friends. Their death was not abstract or distant. It was specific, detailed, documented in diaries and photographs that allow us to know them almost as if we had known them in life. It is also the nature of the mystery. This is not simply an unsolved crime or an unexplained accident. It is a series of facts that defy our understanding of what is possible. Fractures without wounds, flight without visible pursuit, death without apparent cause. The human mind seeks patterns, seeks explanations, seeks meaning. And the Dyatlov case stubbornly refuses to provide any of these things. It is an uncomfortable reminder that there are phenomena in the world that we do not understand, forces that act beyond our knowledge. It is, finally, the shadow of secrecy that envelops the case. Soviet authorities clearly hid something. The classified files, the suppressed testimonies, the hasty closure of the investigation, all suggest that someone, somewhere, knew more than they were willing to reveal. And that suspicion is perhaps more disturbing than any supernatural explanation, because it suggests that not only do we not know what happened that night, but perhaps we are not allowed to know. What questions remain unanswered? Why did they abandon the tent in that manner? No theory satisfactorily explains why 9 experienced people chose to flee toward certain death rather than remain in their shelter or return to it. What caused the traumatic injuries? The internal fractures of Dubinina, Zolotaryov, and Thibaut Brignol defy conventional medical explanations. Avalanche? Fall? Something else? Where did the radiation come from? The contamination detected on some clothing items remains unexplained. Krivonishenko's work history offers a partial explanation, but not all investigators find it satisfactory. What happened to Lyudmila Dubinina's tongue? Was it removed by human action, by post-mortem animal activity, or by some other cause? Theories abound, but none has been confirmed. What were the lights in the sky? Multiple witnesses reported unusual luminous phenomena that night. Military tests? Natural phenomena? Something else? Why was the case classified as secret? What did Soviet authorities know that they were unwilling to share? And does anyone still know? These questions remain open, awaiting answers that may never come. 9 people entered the Ural Mountains in January 1959, seeking adventure, camaraderie, and the satisfaction of a challenge overcome. They were young in the fullest sense of the word, full of energy, of hope, of imagined futures. Igor Dyatlov would have turned 24 that February. He planned to graduate, work as an engineer, perhaps marry someday. He had inventions in his head, future expeditions to plan, an entire life ahead of him. Zinaida Kolmogorova wrote poetry in her diaries. She sang songs by the fire. She loved and was loved, though love sometimes hurts. Lyudmila Dubinina would not let herself be intimidated by anyone or anything. In another era, in another place, she would have been a leader, a pioneer, a voice that could not be silenced. And so with each of them. Unique, irreplaceable lives, cut short by circumstances we still do not understand. The mountain where they died now bears their name. Dyatlov Pass is a place of pilgrimage for hikers, investigators, and the curious. Some go seeking answers. Others go to pay tribute. All find only silence and wind and the overwhelming presence of unanswered questions. The cedar where the 2 Yuris died still stands, its lowest branches torn away forever, a mute witness to the desperation of that night. The tent was reconstructed from the fragments found and is preserved in a museum in Yekaterinburg. Visitors can see the cuts made from the inside, can imagine the hands that wielded the knives, can wonder what those eyes were seeing when they decided that fleeing into the frozen night was preferable to staying. The diaries were transcribed and published, allowing later generations to briefly glimpse the lives and thoughts of the 9. The last words written, the last jokes, the last observations about the weather and the terrain, all preserved in faded ink on yellowed paper. The photographs reveal smiling faces, unaware of what was to come. There is something profoundly disturbing about looking at those images, knowing what we know, and they did not know, that we are looking at people in the last hours of their lives. The victims' families fought for decades to obtain answers. Yuri Yudin, the 10th member who survived due to a back ailment, dedicated his life to the investigation. Dubinina's sisters sought justice until their own deaths. Dyatlov's parents never stopped asking what had killed their son. None of them obtained a satisfactory answer. There is a temptation, when narrating stories like this, to offer a clean conclusion, an explanation that ties up all the loose ends and allows the listener to close the book with a sense of closure. But to do so would be dishonest. The truth is that we do not know what happened at Dyatlov Pass that February night in 1959. We do not know it with certainty, and it is possible we never will. What we do know is this: 9 people died in circumstances that defy conventional explanations. Something, whether natural or artificial, known or unknown, led them to make decisions that proved fatal. And for more than 60 years, that something has eluded all attempts at definitive identification. The Dyatlov case reminds us that the world contains mysteries that may resist even our best efforts to understand them. It reminds us that certainty is a luxury we cannot always afford. And it reminds us that behind every mystery are real people whose lives and deaths deserve to be treated with respect. Igor, Sina, Lyuda, Sasha Kolevatov, Rustem, Yuri Krivonishchenko, Yuri Doroshenko, Kolya, and Semyon. 9 names, 9 lives, a mystery that endures. Perhaps someday, in some forgotten archive, or in some scientific breakthrough yet to come, we will find the missing piece of the puzzle. Perhaps someday we will be able to say with certainty, this is what happened. But until that day, if it ever comes, Dyatlov Pass will keep its secret. The mountains will remain silent, and the question will continue to float in the frozen air of the Urals, unanswered, like the echo of a scream that no one heard. What happened that night? Kholat Syakhl, the mountain of the dead. Some names exist for a reason.